それでは今お話の中に自分自身のセラピストになるというお話があったんですけれども、それについてもう少し教えていただいてもよろしいでしょうか。
Yeah, as I said, we actually had parallel groups of patients, but also of health workers, and the processes are not that different. I think what mindfulness-based approaches address is really the universal mechanisms behind suffering and gaining insight into that and relating kindly to these, and that's part of the cure, to relate in a different way to it, rather than adding up to the suffering by criticizing yourself or avoiding the difficult or getting attached to what we desire. It's really gaining insight into, well, in the impermanence and the changeability of life. So I found not a great deal of difference in offering these to our patients and our mental health workers, or health workers in general. They also tend to be critical of themselves. They are often also high achievers and feeling ashamed for their own vulnerability. So the change is about acknowledging this vulnerability and acknowledging that in a way we're all imperfect, and we already have this imperfect design from an evolutionary perspective. We very much draw on the work of Paul Gilbert here, who developed compassion-focused therapy. That in a way the design of a brain is already setting up to suffering. And it's not our fault. It becomes our responsibility when we gain insight into it. We have a choose to go the wholesome path or the unwholesome path. But the process is really about this insight and then also relating to it in a compassionate way. More recently, John Kabat-Zinn, who's the founder of MBSR, who you could say who started all this secular mindfulness-based approaches in healthcare in the first place. When he's asked nowadays, can you say in one word what mindfulness is? He says, no, I can't, but I can give you two. It's mindfulness and it's relationality. So it's becoming aware of our experience, but also relating to it in a way that is wholesome. And all the changes that we see in the groups are about that, yeah, this is what I observe. And this is how my reactivity in an automatic way often is. That I do this when I don't like it, then I do this when I like it. I either avoid the difficult or I get attached to what feels good. But in these tendencies, most of the suffering is already hidden. Because when we do this when it's unavoidable, or when we do this when we can't really grasp it and it's going anyway, because it's impermanent, we suffer so much more. So compassion is really about releasing this cramp, this contractions in our reactivity, and not just reacting, but becoming responsive, becoming relational in a wholesome way, in a kind and compassionate way. So it's often a revelation already in MBCT with patients with recurrent depression that they come to realize, gosh, my thoughts are just thoughts. They're not facts. But if I believe in them strongly, if I identify with them, yes, I suffer a lot from these thoughts. But if I can see them as just thoughts and as products of my mind desperately trying to get away from suffering, but then beginning to realize, oh, but it just add up to suffering. That's a very, often a very insightful moment that people begin to understand, oh yeah, there I can actually choose a different path. I can follow the thought, or I can just observe it as a thought and respond in a compassionate way. So perhaps to add a little bit more to that, in the MBCL course, there's more explicit practice in this relationality. Already with the practices that make use of our imagination. And we're not just simply observing the mind, but we also begin to work with the mind in a gentle way. In a way, moving from the inner critic to the inner helper. Explore, for instance, what the image of a safe place, how this is received. And we allow the mind to create it. It's not, it should be like this or it should be like that. And it should every time be the same when you do this practice. That's really exploring what comes up when we imagine a safe place. And how do we receive that? And then a compassionate companion, another person or another being, could be an animal, could be anything, could be a fantasy being. How do we receive that, a being that relates to ourselves kindly? That's working with imagination. And you can also imagine yourself being a compassionate being. It's not simply doing tricks, it's another kind of practice. We shouldn't be attached to outcome here or special effects, but it's really exploring what happens if our mind takes on a certain shape. Like if we do yoga with the body, we have a certain posture, a certain asana, and we explore what happens. And in the same way, when we allow our mind to have a certain shape, we explore what happens and therefore gain more insight in what the true face of kindness and compassion is and how we can receive it. And people begin already with the metta practice, the loving kindness practice in the MBSR, but in the MBCL, we really, that's a thread throughout the course, through every session that we offer with this way of practicing through yourself, to a benefactor, to a dear person, a neutral person, difficult person. It goes on throughout the course, to everybody eventually, all beings, in a way that it deepens our relationality. Not just to ourselves, but to the whole world and all beings.
私たちは今年2020年は予想もしなかったコロナパンデミックを経験したのですが、その際に思いやりであるとかマインドフルネスがどのように私たちを助けてくれたでしょうか。それについてお話をお願いいたします。
Yeah, of course, that's a very important question. How does this work relate to everyday life, particularly when something like this happens, which was entirely unexpected and is, yeah, for many, it was the experience of big uncertainty and not knowing how to move forward. For people, well, here in Holland, we had, like in most European countries, a lockdown. It was a partial lockdown. We could still go out for walks as long as we kept our distance. For many, it meant losing the normal routine of their work. Most had to work at home if that was possible at all, or they were out of work. In healthcare, of course, it became very tense to work, particularly the people in the front line dealing with all these patients who could be contaminated, and how to deal with the very ill patients. And you could very much see it was a reaction based on the motivation of threat and how to get away from the threat and how to control the threat. And what was in the news every day was the number of hospital admissions, the number of patients on the intensive care, and the number of deaths. So it was threat all around, and there was part of the population being very busy controlling this threat. Another part sort of standing by, not knowing what to do, having less to do than normally, apart from worrying. So here you could very much see how automatic responses led to more suffering. When we were worrying all the time about what we didn't know how it was going to develop, well, you suffer more. So there was also a lot of creativity in how to face all this. Among mindfulness teachers and also among teachers from traditions, there were a lot of online meditation sessions being offered. I myself was involved with a group of mindfulness teachers. We offered daily meditations online for healthcare workers. And that was attended very well. There was a lot of interest in that. And I think we saw it in many other countries as well, and all over the world, really. So in a time of that, you can see there is an increased need also to pause, to become silent, to share with each other, to sit down and really contemplate what's actually happening to us. And yeah, you saw people being generous in sharing their practices and working freely, offering meditations online. So a lot of people also began to reflect, what was actually, was there something wrong with the lifestyle we led so far, and what could we actually change? In Holland, it was amazing to see a blue sky without the fumes of aeroplanes, and to see a bright, starry night, to hear birds where you would otherwise hear traffic. So it was in a way a stressful time, but also a time when new things begin to emerge. This is how life could also be. And what do we really care for in life? How should we lead our lives? What do we want our lives to stand for? So there was also that. It's not just misery, a period of crisis, but there's also new insights and perhaps awakening of compassion in a more profound way. Yeah, of course, there's a lot more to say to this, but I hope this is the beginning of an answer to your question. Well, thank you very much for inviting me for this interview, and feel really honored that I could share with you what we've done so far here in Europe around our work with the Japanese people in this way. And thank you also to our translator. It must be horrendous to translate all this in Japanese, and feel great awe how you did this.